Morning.
Good morning, good morning. Welcome to day 2 of ETH Belgrade. My name is Anna. I work at the Celo Foundation, and I'm joined by Andy.
Hey, how's it going? I'm Andy. I help run an educational program called Kernel.
And we're here to talk to you today about trust, value, and honor. What are blockchains actually good for? And in this presentation, we have 3 key takeaways that we want to get across. And these keys are that blockchains mean anyone can make money. By enabling us to verify ourselves, we can trust more people. And trusting those that we exchange with directly creates more value. We're going to go into each one of these and explain how this relates to blockchains. But first, we start with trust. And the question here is, can we trust each other? And trust is actually kind of a complicated word because it means a lot of different things to different people. And that's because it has these 2 roots. And the one root of the word trust is triesta, which it means something solid, something foundational. This is how you feel. This is the emotional feeling of how it feels to trust somebody. You know in your bones when you trust someone. And then there's also this second root of the word trust, and it's veritas, which comes from Latin, and it means something true and something trustworthy. It also means something verifiable. And so when people often talk about blockchains and verifiability, they're talking about this second root of the word trust, veritas. And so when we create systems where anybody can verify, then we decrease the number of assumptions people make, and each person can consider to make the whole system more trustworthy. And so we'll get to how this applies to blockchains. But first, how do we actually establish trust? This might seem kind of simple, but take a minute and think for yourself, how do you know when you trust someone in your real life?
Yeah, it's something interesting to reflect upon, especially as we talk about these kind of foundational systems and think about what trust really means. You know, there's this interpretational difficulty in English, right? What do you really mean? Do you mean trust is in how it feels, what it is like to trust someone, tresta, the strong foundation? Does it mean the ability to verify? And when we collapse those 2 things, then we have very reductive discussions about what trust actually is. And so even in trying to understand how it is established in the world, we get confused because we combine what it feels like to trust someone else, which is very much about tresta, right? And that's that first section that you can see. Tresta really is established through these elaborate rituals, right, which have evolved in our culture over thousands and thousands of years. So where I come from, in Africa, we have a very particular set of handshakes. When you shake someone's hand in Africa, you grab the arm at the same time. This is traditionally to show that you're not armed, right? If both of my hands are forward like this, which I can't really do while I'm holding a microphone, then you know that I'm not armed. So there's an indication of trust. In Japan, when you bow to one another, when you greet them, the degree to which you bow is an indication of respect and social order, right? And this is, again, evolved over thousands and thousands of years. There's all of these elaborate rituals that we have for establishing this kind of tresta, this implicit, embodied trust. Right? Again, in Africa, one of the things that you'll see all of the time is this kind of recitation of the lineages or the family names. Very interesting, right? But what it does is it establishes who you are in this moment based on everybody that you've come from, right? And you have these praise singers in Xhosa, this lovely language. You'll see it when they introduce Nelson Mandela or people like this. It's really incredible to listen to, and they'll recite the whole family lineage just so that you can establish who you really are in this moment, and thereby establish trust because you know that you're interlinked with all of your ancestors and all of the people who have come before, and there are these family ties and clan bonds and all of this stuff that goes along with establishing trust, right? The other aspect of this, and this is universal, is gift giving and receiving. When you give gifts or receive, you do this all the time. When you go to somebody's house for dinner, you take a bottle of wine or some cheese, or it depends who you are, right, what you take. But there's always these kinds of elaborate social rituals that have evolved in order to establish this kind of strong foundational kind of trust, right? And then once we know that that's really what's going on at the foundational level, we can talk about verification, right? And verification, again, it begins with gift giving and receiving, particularly in kind of ceremonial formats, because the kind of gift that you give, the way you give it, and the manner in which it is received is part of how social order and verification is established. But then we go much further, right? Because like you get to, you get to these kind of repeat interactions, which is like being good neighbors, and you get to like the deepest kind of trust in Treyster, which is, I trust you with my life, right? This trust through deep time is really, really interesting, because when I trust you with my life, both of our lives are enriched when that trust is reciprocated. And that's really, really interesting. So like what I want to emphasize on this slide is that there are 3 things that are required for really cultivating trust. There's the low miscommunication, which comes about through handshakes, bows, and the recitation of lineages, these kind of like cultural artifacts that we have. Then there's the repeat interactions of being good neighbors, of constantly having to be around people. And then there is the win-win games of trust through deep time. So.
And how does this actually apply to blockchains?
Yeah, well, that's the question, right? Now that we've established what trust actually means, its 2 different roots, and how it's established in the world, well, we can think about like, what does this actually mean in terms of blockchains? And the simple answer here is that blockchains allow us to establish the order of events. It's all about the sequence, right? So if you go back to the Bitcoin white paper, Satoshi is talking about a network of timestamp servers, which enables a new kind of peer-to-peer digital money, right? It's the timestamp servers that are really interesting. He never called them miners, by the way. It was always these timestamp servers, because blockchains, fundamentally, what they allow us to do is establish the order of events through an elaborate ritual we call peer-to-peer consensus, right? Whether that's Nakamoto consensus or Tendermint or proof of stake, it's kind of less relevant. All you need to know at this particular stage is there's this elaborate ritual, much like we've always had, but just in a digital form, that is allowing us, right, to establish trust about the way that things have happened, the order in which they have happened, without having to rely on anybody in the middle, right? And that's really important. And it's kind of interesting to think about how that actually happens, right? Because we have all of these talks which will tell you, oh, blockchain is immutable and it's verifiable, and once the thing's in the block, then it's always like that. But think about what actually goes on in these networks, right? Like, why is it persuasive to order the sequence of events in this particular way? Well, it's because anybody who's participating fully in the network gets to decide the order of events in their blocks if they're rewarded the ability to move the network forward, right? And there are no assumptions in the consensus or in the way that these systems work about the particular order of events. There's no impositional dogma about how you have to order the events in any particular block that you mine or are elected to propose, depending on what kind of consensus we're using. It's really important to recognize this, because there's no one unified version of reality in a blockchain. It can fork at any time, it often does. That's part of the design of the system, right? This is part of the elaborate ritual that we are enacting to establish trust about the order in which stuff has happened, because all there is are transparent incentives about how power is allocated over time, right? So in this kind of system, what we're really concerned about is our ability, each person who is participating fully, to decide upon the order of events and then have that etched into shared consensus over time.
Yeah, and like Andy said, this means that blockchains are foundational systems for more trustworthy forms of money. Because we're able to decrease these unverifiable assumptions that you have to rely on third parties to trust whether or not the money has actually entered the bank, or if the bank updated a ledger, if that money has left the bank, if it's cleared. The clearinghouses, you can actually verify, anybody can verify. And this is what's actually really important about blockchains, is that it creates more trustworthy forms of money.
Yeah, it's all about the money, right? This is something that it's really important to kind of get home. When we say that blockchains are all about making money, I mean that very, very literally. I don't mean it in the sense of some corporate shill who's here to tell you, oh, you can make money if you use this technology. I'm here to say you can actually make money. And that's what's always been interesting about blockchains. From the very moment that the Bitcoin white paper is published on that mailing list in 2008, it's all about the money, right? Money is the killer application. This is what Andreas Antonopoulos always used to say in his Bitcoin presentations. But it's not to say that we're not interested in all of the various other use cases of blockchains which are being talked about these days, the social uses and various other things that are being explored in conferences like this. It's just to remind people that when you really go looking for use cases of blockchains, it's all about the money, right? If you can change the kind of money that we use to operate, then you can change the way in which we achieve and establish trust between ourselves, and therefore the way that we perceive what is valuable in the world. This is the deepest level of what we can do with this technology. It's not to say that there aren't other use cases that can be built on top of this, but at its foundational level, it's all about the money.
And that brings us to value. And so the questions here are, what do you value? And what are your values? And so Andy already talked about this a little bit in how we establish trust. And he talked about that there's really 3 key things about trust, and it's low miscommunication, repeat interactions, win-win games. But how does that actually apply to money that we currently have? Well, with low miscommunication, we actually already have this with currency. So everything has a price. You go to cafeteria to get a coffee, it has a price. There's low miscommunication, you pay that price, you get a coffee. It's really simple. Currency. The currency that we currently have solves for this. There's no miscommunication. Everything can have a price. Repeat interactions, we kind of also have this, but of what kind? What kind of repeat interactions with money do you have on a day-to-day basis? And then win-win games, almost never we have win-win games with current monetary systems. There's very few situations in which there's win-win games. But programmable money can actually solve this. And what Andy talks about making money, we literally mean programmable money. And you can program money to have win-win games. And we'll touch on one kind of money of this further in the presentation. Yeah. But first, what is the evolution of money?
Yeah, exactly. Just to really emphasize this point, right? Like what we're here to do, and what this has always been about for me, for sure, is about like consciously participating in the evolution of money. Right? Anna's right, everything has a price in the world around us. When we reduce things to price, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It does allow for these kinds of low miscommunication environments when we can specify exactly what the value of something is, what people need to part with in order to get it. Right? Get a coffee at the cafeteria, buy a flight to Belgrade. All of these kinds of things are enabled by the fact that we have a kind of abstraction of value in the form of current money that allows us to do these things and interact in smooth and efficient manners. But what we're really interested in with programmable money, right, is what kinds of repeat interactions can we generate such that we're living kind of more wholesome, interesting, balanced, relatable lives? And in particular, right, what is the nature of the win-win games that we can play? Most economic transactions that we enter into at the moment are called win-loss or winner-takes-all. Okay, I'll explain exactly what these are in a moment. But it's really, really important to remember that trust is bred in environments of low miscommunication, repeat interactions, win-win games, because those touch on both of its roots, Tresta and Veritas. And once we understand that, we can then begin to think quite deeply about what it means to program money such that it leads to win-win games. The reason that this is important is because this is what the current monetary system does, right? There's a trade-off at work here. When we get low miscommunication, this is the kind of system that we have to instantiate to get that. Now, this is the work of untold numbers of people over many, many generations, so I'm not here to really denigrate it that much, but it is the ultimate pyramid scheme, right? Like what you have in the current economic system is basically a pyramid of different kinds of money. At the top, the most important kind of money, it used to be gold in '71, that was changed at Bretton Woods, it's now Federal Reserve notes. Then beneath that, you have deposits, right? Rather currency, deposits, and credit, right? These are the different kinds of money that we have in our system at the moment. Now, in boom cycles, you can see this little animation going on there. It's now booming, right? In boom cycles, all of those monies expand. You have more credits, you have more deposits, more currency, and they all begin to look like one another, right? Credit looks like deposits, looks like currency, looks kind of like Federal Reserve notes, right? And in these boom cycles, it's really, I always forget this part, it's really the monetarists who seem right? That discipline is the active requirement in our economic systems. But then in bust cycles, when the economy is squeezed or under pressure, right, then the differences between these four kinds of money are reestablished, right? You very quickly in a bust realize that your credit is not the same as deposits in a bank, which are not the same as actual currency, which is definitely not the same as Federal Reserve notes, right? And then in those kinds of cycles, the Keynesians who look right and they're like, we need more elasticity, right? So this is really a story about the elasticity and discipline of money, which is happening at every cycle, right? Like the economy cycles like this at every scale that we can look at. So it cycles like this on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, in terms of seasons. It's always cycled this way in terms of seasons because of agricultural production and the way that that booms and busts depending on the environmental conditions. And the whole work, right, of the monetary class over the last like literally 1,000 years or so, has been to try and smooth these inevitable boom and bust cycles based on the environments in which we operate, right? And the most powerful tools that we have for doing that when we arrange money like this, such that we can achieve low miscommunication when exchanging stuff, is interest rates and the monetary supply, right? So these are the two primary tools. If you have Federal Reserve notes at the top of your ultimate pyramid scheme, these are the two primary tools you have to try and smooth out the inevitable cycles in any economic system, right? Now we know that given the complexity of the current global economy, these two little levers that most central bankers have are not sufficient, right? Central bankers, despite what you might hear in conferences like this, are generally speaking nice people, and they're very well educated and they're very good at what they do. The problem is that they're faced with complex systems with very, very limited tools. When you expand the monetary supply, all of a sudden you find yourself in a position a few years down the line where you need to increase the interest rates rapidly, and that results in a whole bunch of banks failing because they didn't write their bonds to market, for instance, in the case of Silicon Valley. But there's many other reasons, right? Like these two tools are not powerful enough to control the inevitable cycles in economies. And what we're talking about when we say that like blockchains allow us to make money is they allow us to make the best kind of money, right? What does it mean if we have programmable money that is more dynamic, flexible, and responsive than Federal Reserve notes at the top of this pyramid?
And luckily there are alternatives, and programmable money allows us to create other kinds of money, like ultrasound money. And so blockchains actually give us the tools to enable flexible, responsive monetary policy that is different from what we've ever had before. And this is why money is the killer app of blockchains, because it allows us to do the things that were never really possible before.
Yeah, exactly. When we say flexible, we mean Ethereum's monetary supply, its M2, right, is decided dynamically based on use of the network. So when lots of people are using the network, there's lots of transaction fees, more ETH is burnt than is produced as rewards for validators, so the network is deflationary. When not lots of people are using the network, then more rewards are given to validators than ETH is burned in transactions, so the monetary supply is inflationary. This is not decided by a central group of unelected bureaucrats, it's just decided by virtue of the way that the network is created. That's very interesting, right? It goes further than this, right? This is just the first idea of how to do like flexible, adaptive monetary supply at the protocol level. There's lots of others. For instance, this comes from a friend of mine called Chris Goers, who's part of building a network called Anoma, where they're thinking, well, actually trust is the dynamic parameter. So I don't need to have like global trust to exchange with Dave. We know each other, he's a nice guy. I don't need to like send a transaction which is settled globally just to pay him for coffee now when we go to the cafeteria. You can select what kind of trust you need based on the nature of the interaction you're having. That's one idea, right? And Chris's point, which I really just wanted to like bring home in this presentation, is that if we want variety in our world, then we need variety in our accounting systems, right? So we're not here to advocate for one kind of money. We're here to advocate for the possibility of programmable money to do all kinds of things in terms of how we know and can learn to trust one another and what it means to value stuff in the world, particularly value stuff in the world in a way that aligns with our values, right? That's really interesting. That's at the protocol layer, right? Ultrasound money, different kinds of trust. Trust is a dynamic parameter. Chris talks about scale-free credit and scale-free consensus. But that's just protocols, right? What about the application layer? Well, in order to understand that, we've got the example of Maker, which I'll discuss very, very briefly. But before saying that, I just want to come back to this notion of win-win games, right? Like, what does that actually mean when we're talking about the programming of money, right? Well, there's a paper that you can see up on the slides here. It's a Jupyter notebook. It's really interesting. It means you can go in and actually play with this thing if you can write a little bit of Python. And it proves, the screenshot here in particular, shows that the initial distribution of wealth in an economy and the geographic dispersal of actors, where people are, does not matter in terms of the long-term generation of wealth inequality, right? So like if we look at the Gini coefficients or these kinds of measures of inequality in a system, the initial distribution of money and where people are doesn't matter. The only thing that really matters in terms of how wealth inequality is generated over time is the nature of transactions, right? When you have win-loss or winner-takes-all transactions, i.e. if I buy a put or a call in a stock market, right, and I'm in the money, that means somebody else is out of the money, right? If I make money when I buy a stock, it means somebody else loses money, right? That's a winner-take-all transaction. These are the kinds of transactions that we enter into on a daily basis when we use the current financial system and that ultimate pyramid scheme. Here, what we're really interested in is how do we get to win-win transactions? What does that actually look like? Because we can prove that when we have win-win transactions, has a stark effect on wealth inequality in a system, which is ultimately what like making programmable money is all about. It's always been about financial freedom, right? Like I'm not here to get more wealthy, I'm here to redefine what wealth means. And what wealth means is not what I can accumulate. Wealth means having enough to share, right? That's what it's always been about. And here is a proof in Python that this is what actually happens when you can program win-win transactions. So what does that look like? Well, like one example is Maker. Right, it's probably the best known example at the moment. There are many of them, but this is my favorite because what's going on in Maker is that if I hold MKR, the governance token, right, I have the ability to make decisions about the way the system is parameterized. This means the collateralization ratios, the debt ceilings, the different kinds of collateral that are included in the system, and the DAI stability rate. If, as a holder of the MKR token, I make good decisions about those kinds of parameters, then the system will likely perform well, more DAI will be brought into existence than are needed. That DAI can be used to buy back Maker, burn it, decrease the supply of Maker, and thereby increase the price of my tokens. It's a win-win transaction when I vote on particular governance parameters with a token that is intrinsically important to the economic function of the system. MKR functions as the lender of last resort in the Maker system. Similarly speaking, right, there's a balanced incentive because on the other side, if I make poor choices about the parameters and include a kind of collateral which is too risky, there is a very good chance that the system becomes under-collateralized. When that happens, without any human intervention, more Maker is printed into existence, sold on the open market, and used to pay down the bad debt in the system. Right? So you have these balanced incentives, and the notion of win-win transactions begins to become attainable outside the realm of human interference, which is very, very interesting. You don't have a unelected bureaucrat sitting there deciding on what these parameters are in the Maker system. You have people voting on it, right? This is like the very beginning of what win-win transactions can look like at the application layer.
And so so we have the protocol layer, like ultrasound money, and then we have the application layer, which Andy touched on a little bit, like Maker is an application. But then what about money? Like how can you actually have applied money and programmable money? And we talk about different kinds of money, but what kinds of money can we really make? And in this video here, Naval talks to Sep, who's one of the co-founders of Celo protocol. And in this talk, they talk about 5 features of money. And they present 5 different ideas for what kinds of money you can create with these kinds of flexible and responsive systems. And one of them is natural capital-backed currencies, which is really interesting. And the idea behind natural capital-backed currencies here is whatever backs money, people will make more of in the world. So back in the day when money was backed by gold, people rushed to mine gold because gold is what backed money. So if you can get more gold, you can have more money, you can accumulate more wealth. But what if there's a way to program money to be backed by things we actually want to see in the world, like clean forests or clean water or things that we want to preserve? Would that then change the incentive to, instead of cutting down the rainforest, to then protecting the rainforest, because that's actually what backs money? And there's some of the experiments around this, around tokenizing carbon credits, around tokenizing land and tokenizing, different tokenizing experiments. And this is just one kind of money. And then we also have UBI, money going directly to people. There's some experiments with that. None of them are by no means perfect, but these are interesting things that you can start to think about when you understand some of these underlying principles around money. And then demurrage, which is the idea that you have to pay a small amount to hold money. So it actually costs money, or it costs money to hold money. And then community currencies. There's also lots of experiments now with community currencies. And the kind of money we're going to talk about can be considered about a kind of community currency that we'll get to. And then money without interest-bearing debt. And this is a really, really interesting one, because currently, that's not the case. Currently, money is backed by debt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're going to talk about this right now. But just before we do so, I wanted to finish off our theoretical part, which is the quickest that I've ever done theory in the world. Dave can attest to that. We made it just with a reference to where a lot of this thinking comes from, right? Which is a man called David Grieber. And the whole point that I really want to drive home, having now discussed everything about Tresta, Veritas, how it applies to value, the way in which these elaborate rituals help us understand what it means to trust one another, how we can verify that trust in the world, how that affects the way that we think about value through low miscommunication, repeat interactions, win-win games. Well, it all comes down not to a body of theory, but to a kind of faith, right? And it's really a faith in one another. And it's a faith that has to be lived, right? In order to realize these kinds of money and the effect that they can have in the world, we have to live, we have to embody the kind of society which we know is possible, right? And this is probably like the most profound point that David makes in an incredible body of work, really, is that it comes down to embodying in who and how you are what it really means to live by your values, right? To live by your values in a way that actually can translate into the sorts of systems we use for exchanging with one another based on what we value, right? It's the same idea as Gandhi, be the change you want to see in the world, right? This pattern comes up repeatedly, but it's really worth pushing home here before we actually get to the practical part of this talk, that you really, like this is the thing that's difficult to communicate in all of our presentations, right? It's one thing to be able to write the code and show you interfaces for what different kinds of money can look like, to talk about Maker, or to talk about Anoa, to talk about Rai, to talk about all of these currency experiments that represent value in a different way and that change what could be the ultimate kind of money sitting at the top of that whole scheme. But what it comes down to is a certain kind of courage and honesty in each one of us to live by our values and to hold the others that we trust to that same kind of standard, even though our values might differ. So
now we get to actually making money.
Now we actually get to make money. Hell yeah. All right, after all of that, what does it mean to really make money? Actually make money, given that we now have this programmable thing that we can do, which is fundamentally different to anything that has existed prior to it. Well, we have this paper. It's called Web3 Social, the soul of Web3, which has been roundly criticized in the time since it was released by Glenn Weil and Zoe Hitzig and Vitalik. Because this is the paper in which they talked about soulbound tokens, and they used NFTs as the example. But the most interesting part of this paper is actually this quote, which is that access to high bandwidth, authentic communication channels can be gated with tokens. It's very interesting when you think about that, particularly in the context of this talk. Now, the problem is that when you gate access to these kinds of high bandwidth, authentic communication channels with something which is an asset, right, then the incentive that people have when they get into those communication channels is to manipulate others and speculate on the value of that token. Right? And this is what we see happen over and over again in all of our communities. This is why ICOs sucked. It's Fundamentally, because when you use a token that is an asset to govern other people, you mix the worst parts of capitalism with tyranny, right? Think about that very carefully the next time you use tally or snapshot or these kinds of things, right? We're using assets to govern one another, using this old kind of thinking about what value is and how it might be represented in the world to exercise power over one another, rather than figure out how we relate to one another, given that we might have different values. Now, instead of doing that, we can use the same infrastructure, but we can use tokens to represent different stuff, right? So what happens if instead of tokens representing assets, we made a token that adheres to all of the standards, in this case ERC20, because it's more interesting than the NFT standard for this particular kind of use case, and we make it represent liabilities, right? What happens then? If you gate access to high bandwidth authentic communication channels with a token that represents a liability or an obligation, then all of a sudden the incentive when people get into that channel is to find other people to work with and to serve so that their liabilities might be forgiven, right? Same token, same mechanism, token gate, but because the token represents something different, which is just a story, right? The code is exactly the same. It's the story that we tell one another that differs here. Because that story is different, all of a sudden the incentives shift toward much more pro-social behavior. It's really interesting. So this is kind of what that looks like if you go.
Yeah, and it basically inverts the relationship between assets and liabilities, so that now actually having a higher balance represents a bad thing, because if you accumulate this token, then you have more obligations to other people, and then you have to have somebody to forgive those obligations to you. So there's no longer an incentive to accumulate the token, but there's an incentive to then find other people and to collaborate and to have more pro-social outcomes. And yeah, this is how it would actually work.
So here you see the Kernel website, which is an educational program that I'm involved with running. We have a syllabus, which is free and open source and always will be. But we have a particular lesson about money and speech, which we've now gated with this token. However, you don't have to pay anything to get this token. You can see what's going on here is I just connected my wallet, and now I can ask to take on some tokens, which I do with one click. Right? I don't have to buy these things because your payment is your commitment to participate. Here we are accepting those tokens. And as soon as I accept the tokens and they land in the wallet, there's the content, right? So it's the same kind of notion of a token gate, except I don't have to buy the tokens. Taking on the tokens, which are minted from thin air, because that's what all tokens are. Indeed, that's what all money is. It's just a question of who gets to mint it and under what conditions, right? That's always what's at stake when we're talking about quantitative easing, M2, all of this economic stuff that sounds really, really dry if you read like FedWire or like the Financial Times or these kinds of like really interesting but difficult to pass publications. Like it's always about who gets to make these tokens and under what conditions. Here, you want to read a particular piece of content about money and speech on a free educational website. Sure, it's free, right? But now you have to take on a token, which is your commitment to participate. That's kind of interesting. Next up, what does this actually look like at a design level? I've already said that it's an ERC20 standard, but there are some changes to how we think about this because it's important in terms of representing value and allowing us to establish trust in interesting ways that lead to more valuable exchanges. So the ERC20 standard has been slightly changed in that we took out all of the transfer and approve functions. So this leads to the design of all on are the same, but they're created only when I accept another person's proposal. So you saw that happening over there. Basically, like when somebody proposes tokens to me that's stored as a mapping in the contract, and then I need to accept that proposal in order for tokens to be minted from the 0 address to my address. Similarly speaking, people can forgive me my liabilities if I do work for them, if I help them, if I collaborate with them, if I teach them, whatever it is. And again, when somebody proposes forgiveness to you, that's stored as a mapping in the contract, and then you can accept that, which sends the tokens back from your address to the 0 address. So you're never transferring tokens one between the other, but there is this notion that you can like propose, forgive, honor, and accept these kinds of tokens. This is very interesting, right? Like I've done a lot of work on community currencies, on Maker, on locally exchange traded systems, on alternative forms of currency across the board. And one of the really interesting features that you find about these kinds of currencies is that they have a sort of a half-life, right? Like they exhibit this decay function because there's two problems, right? Like the one is that if you have like a single community currency with a single symbol, like ON, H-O-N here, then when people leave the network, i.e., with ON I can get a dentist's appointment, and I can go to the baker, and I can go to the candlestick maker, and I can get all of these things. If the dentist leaves town and goes somewhere else in the global economy, then all of a sudden the utility of my currency has dropped a lot. You find this happens over and over and over again in community currencies. It decays over time because people have to compete against the global economy, which is really, really difficult to do, and it's one of the tensions in community currency design is how do you have a community currency which operates in local contexts, but nevertheless has some kind of meaning in a global world. It's very difficult to design that kind of stuff. However, with global ledgers that settle everywhere, that's perhaps no longer the case, right? And the reason for this is that you can have one thing, right? One symbol. This is ON. There's other symbols that you could use, right? People can reason about that to a first degree. They don't have to, there's not a huge amount of mental overhead in thinking about all of these different kinds of tokens, which are often a result of other kinds of community currency designs. But those tokens are unique to you. You can't transfer them anywhere. So this is very interesting. They are soul-bound, right? Like what we're actually talking about here are soul-bound ERC20 tokens. But they're not soul-bound in the sense that's talked about in that initial paper that I referenced because they're consensual, right? And they're one global symbol, right? If you know anything about community currency design, you will know that there are all of these proposals to have, for instance, like my currency and Anna's currency, and then when we interact, we can have a transitive web of trust, such that like if I trust Anna and Anna trusts Dave, then I can like send tokens to Dave through Anna, right? This is how Circles works. It's a lot of how like a lot of various different community currency designs work. It's very interesting, but what it means is that like if we use these kinds of systems as our main kind of money, then I have to keep track of a whole bunch of different trust connections and remember that Anna has a different kind of currency to me, who has a different kind of currency to Dave, and that becomes quite difficult to reason about for human beings. So this way, we have like a single currency, it's unique to each holder, it's consensual, and it results in these pro-social incentives.
Well, I think one thing that's also really important to ground this whole system in is there's the technical protocol, which is like how honor could actually work. But then the thing with community currencies that Andy was speaking about and about this half-life actually has more to do with the social protocol, so how this community currency is actually used. And these are all just experiments. And like this is what's really interesting is like to get you to think about what kind of experiments are possible. But for example, we presented this idea at Celo, which was a community of a lot of crypto and Web3 people living together in Montenegro. And we presented a very interesting use case for this. For example, we were already all living there, so there was already a lot of like social connections made. There was a lot of like social, the web of trust was already there. But then, for example, like what if you could use a system like this to gate access to specific events? Like, for example, to attend some of the talks and the tracks that we had during the whole time that we were living there, like, what if you could propose that somebody take on to attend an event? But then, instead of this being you're paying to attend the event, you're actually committing to participate actively in this event, and then to forgive your liability afterwards, maybe you need to put away the chairs or like clean up the space and help the organizers. So then instead of paying and then making this be a transactional relationship, you're actually taking on an obligation, and then you have to do something in response to like help the organizers and help this whole thing function. And then this completely changes the relationship from a transactional win-loss game to something that starts to look much more like a win-win game and starts to look much more like an actual community. And so these are some of the like applications on the social layer that could be possible with something like this.
Yeah. So before we show the last video, which is the interface for Honor, this is the point that I really want to drive home when I say it's all about the money, and it always has been. Coordination, everything else, all the other memes that you see of astronauts and astronauts and astronauts, it all depends on money, right? Cui bono, who benefits? Where does the money go to? What kind of money are we using, right? This is the fundamental thing that I really want to get home here, is that we all swim in a certain kind of water of which we are not aware. This is always true across history. There's like some kind of paradigm that we operate within, which once it is named as paradigm, suddenly gets to be seen as obsolete. But before that happens, we operate as if that were just the truth of the world, whereas it's not. It's constructed by human perception and collective social interactions. And that particular paradigm that we currently operate under is the simple idea, right, that money has to be earned. Right, really think about that. That's what we all think, right? Like money has to be earned. Who I am is measured by how much money I can make. And even if you're on the other side of this and you think, well, let's make sure that there's UBI because AI is coming and hell, we need to definitely have just money given to everybody as quickly as we possibly can because we have enough resources to make sure that poverty can be alleviated across the globe and we just lack the political will. All of that is true, but you still think of money as a good thing, right? You still think of money as an asset that ought to be hoarded. Right, when you're advocating for a UBI that is primarily based on a kind of money that is a part of that pyramid scheme that we saw earlier, right? When you let go of that idea, when you really let go of that idea that money has to be earned, then all of a sudden these possibilities that we're talking about become more tangible, right? And I know how ridiculous that is to sound because what do you mean money has, if I don't earn money, then how do we know whose contributions are valuable? How do we determine who gets access to particular kinds of things and others who don't? Want to just be chaos and anarchy. Well, that's why I quoted Grieber, right? Because anarchy doesn't mean no rules. It just means no rulers, right? No rulers. It means there's no appeal to authority. There's nobody to tell you what's right or wrong. It's the dictates of your own heart. And fundamentally, this idea that money has to be earned, it doesn't lead to a good world. It doesn't lead to a happy place where we can have wholesome relationships and where we can redefine what wealth means. It always leads to some kind of extraction. It always leads to some kind of manipulation. It always leads to incentives that are out of line with what it actually means to collaborate in a wise and healthy fashion. And so the question that these kinds of programmable monies will ask all of us, right, is what if money isn't an asset to hoard, but a measure of the promises I've made, a measure of the obligations that I have, right? A very, very interesting notion, and hopefully one that will lead to more pro-social outcomes. This is what the Honor interface actually looks like at the moment. If you go to honor.community, you can find it and you can start using it. It's on Girly at the moment, but you know, that is less relevant because as soon as you have these kinds of systems that are able to represent value in any particular way, you can use them wherever you like. What's going on here is one account is proposed onto another account. You can see that the trust score between them is currently 0 and the proposing account's balance is shown. Then the transaction is being accepted. I'll explain a little bit more about the trust score in a moment. That same account is now going to go and propose on back to the account that originally proposed it, and you'll see that the trust score is increased to 2. This is just one possible way of building the interface. All of it is open source. And the thing that's really interesting about like what's going on here is it is, in my opinion, impossible to fully spec out a currency that can handle both creditworthiness and trustworthiness at the level of the spec, right? Like in the code itself. Because creditworthiness and trustworthiness are so contextual, it's really, really impossible to get all of this stuff down into the level of code. However, when you have a very, very simple design and the contracts that we can build at this application layer, then all of a sudden you can build any number of social interfaces to this which implement different ways of deciding upon trust. In this particular interface that we just showed, the way that the trust score works is every time I interact directly with your accounts, we get +2. Right? Every time I interact with an account that you've interacted with before, this kind of transitive web of trust, we get +1. Every time your account is involved in a transaction that is double the order of, like twice, two orders of magnitude larger than the average transaction associated with that account, it gets -1, right? That's a very, very, very simple way of doing the trust algorithm. I think there are much more interesting ways. I wanted to sort of see the way that people use the system, do some behavioral analysis, think about Ostrom's principles for the commons and graduating sanctions. All of this kind of stuff can go into the trust algorithm. But the fundamental point is that this is just one of many possible interfaces, right? Anybody can write an interface and write their own trust algorithm and use the same contracts, just as anybody can use on in any number of different ways. Again, this is the power of programmable money because it gets us back to our three keys, which we began the talk with and which we'll end the talk with, which is that anybody can make money, right? That's what blockchains allow. And I don't mean it as a shill, like this is going to be the way that you profit and look after you and yours, right? I mean it in a much, much, much more literal way. Anybody can make money. That is the killer application. It always has been, right? In order to understand what it actually means to make money and to do so in pro-social and healthy and wise ways, we need to recognize that being able to verify ourselves allows us to trust more people, right? Lower number of assumptions in a verifiable system means we can trust potentially more people. We can have potentially more valuable exchanges, right? And when we can have those exchanges directly, we can create more value, right? That's really like an absolutely critical point when we think about what it actually means to make money that enables us to interact in wise and wholesome ways. So that's it. This is a quote from the Thanksgiving address. I encourage you to read it. It's very beautiful. The Thanksgiving address is a wonderful place to start every day. This comes from the end of it because we've been inverting everything for the whole presentation. But thank you very much for listening. And we'll take some questions. We have a few.
We have a few minutes to take some questions.
Dave.
The incentive to take on a token which is an asset is clear. That's like our kind of monkey brain thinking. How do you get people to, how do you incentivize people to want to take on tokens which represent liabilities? Like, what's the incentive to do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a good question. I don't really know. is the honest answer, right? Like one example is the token gate on the money and speech content in Kernel. If people really want to read that post, if you really want to understand what we think about money and speech, then you'll take on one on. The same goes, like when we're talking about access to high bandwidth authentic communication channels, if you maintain one of these high bandwidth authentic communication channels, then there's always an incentive to join it, because like one of the natural human desires or impulses or drives is to connect with others, right? We're social creatures. That's fundamentally one of the things that we require for like healthy living. So that seems to be like one of the most low-hanging fruits in terms of like what ways could we encourage people to use the system. The idea here, right, like when in the history of like locally exchange traded systems, for instance, there's a wonderful group of people out in Canada who are called Open Money. They wrote the Open Money Manifesto back in the 90s, a very interesting document. And they built this system. They were a bunch of functional programmers, and they built like a very 90s website where you can go on and you can create your own money. Everybody has their own namespaces for currency. If you're a functional programmer, you know what I mean. And the idea was you would play this game, right? You would play this game with these functional namespace currency things. And the more that people played the game, the theory at least went, the more they would recognize, oh, holy shit, we can just use this as currency. We don't need to change anything. And so like this is some of my thinking as it applies to Honor, is can we get people interacting with these contracts in enough diverse contexts across different communities such that more and more we can just realize, oh wow, we can actually just use this as it is, right? It begins as like a game, a sort of, oh, okay, so you can implement a little API and like a little token gate on kernel, that's nice. But then if more and more things have this kind of feature or use these kinds of tokens. Another example is like Biddle Giddle streams. They're kind of strange in the sense that like the way that Austin streams money to people when you're building with him is he'll set up a stream with say 5 Ethernet, invite 10 contributors, give each one 0.5 of that stream, and each contributor can withdraw the full 0.5 immediately upon joining the stream, which seems very strange. It's easy to manipulate. It turns out people don't do that in these small social groups because there's social pressure not to, and to like submit contributions that then you can get paid for because people feel that there's like a sense of accountability there. But the idea for that would be that if you withdraw the whole thing at the beginning of your stream, you take on more on, right? It's just as a representation that you're taking on more obligation by removing from the communal pool so much early on, and more on means you're then incentivized later on that month or whatever it is to teach others, to give back to them. These things, it can work in tandem with current sort of like asset-based thinking that allows us to sort of Trojan horse this stuff into our ways of thinking about value.
I think we're right on time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wish you a very happy conference.